Tonight's lecture is an annual lecture of the University Scholars Program, and in particular, I want to give a special thanks to our senior advisory group that had worked on putting this together. So, Michaela and Ginny and Mariah and Alec, alumni who showed up to these voices. I can't see what, well, let's give a thank you to them. One of the core aspects of the University Scholars Program is the development of how do we integrate our learning around key issues that are germane to our culture today. What it means to learn. And this is throughout all of SPU's common curriculum. And so tonight situates a conversation that's really important to us to hear. And so as we started looking at key questions, Dr. Reggie Williams was a name that rose very quickly that we wanted to attend to. So let me introduce Dr. Williams to you. Tonight he'll provide his lecture, and at the end of the lecture we'll have some time for question and answers. So please save some questions for the end, and Dr. Williams will dialogue with you about them. Dr. Reggie Williams is on the faculty at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. His PhD in Christian ethics comes from Fuller Theological Seminary. He also is also from Westmont College and did his Bachelor of Arts degree, so he has some affiliation with the CCCU schools as well. His dissertation work, Christ-Centered and Empathetic Resistance, the Influence of the Harlem Renaissance Theology on Incarnational Ethics of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, has had huge influence in circles looking at Bonhoeffer scholarship, taking the questions of Dietrich Bonhoeffer to a very broad but also very embodied voice. His book, which comes out of his initial research, entitled Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic of Resistance, has been well reviewed and part of panels at the American Academy of Religion. For those of you who don't have his book, just as a shameless plug that I will give you, Baylor University Press has sent us some flyers which are on the back table, right there, you can see that there, and you can get a 20% off purchase with that for coming to the lecture tonight. Dr. Williams' work continues to transgress many of the questions that are traditionally siloed questions in theology, trying to bring the body and the soul and the spirit together. As he works with aspiring people of the church in McCormick, as he looks at the institutions of higher education and how we deal with reason and art and embodiment, he continues to be a key voice. Tonight, his topic, as you can see, is the Black Jesus in Christian Ethics, the implications for Christian moral life derived from valuing the body of Christ as black. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Reggie Williams.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm very honored by the invitation and the welcoming that I work with grad students, and I used to for a few years I was working with undergrads. Be able to have an invitation from undergrads to come back into an undergraduate environment is tremendously honoring. That's like getting a good review at the end of a course. You get a really good review. They think well of you, so you feel a little bit better. Maybe go watch a movie or something. I'm really grateful. And this is, I think, the second time that I've been in Seattle. I don't mind the rain. I don't mind it. Right now, it's a little colder in Chicago. So, again, thank you for that. Meeting new friends, re-engaging old friends. Pastor Greg, who was to see Greg again introduced himself, reminded me that he was at the Bonhoeffer Conference in 2012 at Union Theological Seminary when we were celebrating the completion of the 16 volumes of all of Bonhoeffer's work translated into English. I had the opportunity to speak there at that engagement. Very amazing, powerful times. You know, if you know anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he spent a year studying at Union Theological Seminary when he was turned 25 while he was there, after completing 2 dissertations and getting established at the University of Berlin as a professor at 24. He was a sharp guy. So, yeah, good to see you again. And my friend, your esteemed professor of theology, Dr. Brian Bantam, we met when he was writing his comprehensive exams at Duke Divinity School, and I wasn't there yet, and I was like a freshman in high school, and he was near senior status, and a god. Very grateful, very honored to be walking around near him. No, but in all seriousness, it's good to have colleagues, like-minded colleagues in the academy that can be somewhat of a lonely place. He's a good friend, and I'm really honored to be in your space here. And here's, by way of this is a long-winded introduction, forgive me. By way of confession, when I started the work on my dissertation, Brian is one of the people I looked up to tremendously. And so I asked him, because of some of the work that I was doing, where would you point me to do some work or to read some theology from the Harlem Renaissance? He said, there isn't any. You're going to have to do it yourself. That was that voice was all I listened to for what work would be done theologically in the Harlem Renaissance, and I took him seriously. So that's a large part of my book. You'll see Dietrich what is the title of my book? Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. Harlem Renaissance Theology. Harlem Renaissance Theology and Ethic of Resistance. I took him seriously. And that is the content of this current work that I'm doing as well. What I will introduce you to tonight is really the contours of this book project that I began working on during my sabbatical last year. And I look forward to finally getting writing on this. So without further ado, let me begin. I had playing quietly when you came in a song by a favorite jazz artist named Gregory Porter. The song, and I would play it again for you, but I think we have a short here. The song is called Painted on Canvases. It's a really good description of how identities are formed in society. It says, we are like children. We're painted on canvases, picking up shades as we go. We start off with gesso, brushed on by people we know. Watch your technique as you go. Step back and admire my view. Do I have some say what you use? And then that's as much as I can remember off the top of my head at the moment. But it's a very powerful engagement with the way society works. And he says we are also, there's a line that says we are known by our hue. That's the point that I'm getting at this evening. So the title, Black Jesus, Christian Ethics, the implications for Christian moral life derived from valuing the body of Christ as black. Without further ado. The house lights dim over the audience, and the stage lights bright, drawing attention to the front of the theater. A male voice booms through a loudspeaker with a provocative question that shocks and unsettles those in attendance. What is a Negro? This is how the Harlem Renaissance playwright Allison Hughes begins his play titled, It's Midnight Over Newark. The play was written to be a communal experience, what Craig Prentice describes as a living newspaper, reporting information to inspire and to change an interactive audience. The provocative question was more than lines in a script. What is a Negro was instructive. In the course of the play, it becomes apparent that an answer to that question is multi-layered, and in the small cross-section of society seated in the audience, there exists numerous answers that are commonly believed to be true about black people within the broader society. Many scholars who study race agree that what race tells us about one another has a history that is more accurately perceived by revealing the cloaked influences of economic, political, and religious interests. These interests play a significant role over time of helping to stabilize what Charles Taylor and Willie Jennings describe as the social imaginary. For our purposes, we may describe this imaginary as a set of distorted lenses placed behind our eyes. It's with regard to race. a set of distorted lenses placed behind our eyes within the collective mind of society, resulting in a racialized aesthetic, a customary way of seeing people that is regulated by the historically people-distorting standard of white men as template humanity. From the early 1920s through the mid-1930s, black intellectuals and artists of the Harlem Renaissance sought to interrogate the intersection of economics, politics, and white religion as the causal effect, generating distorted public knowledge of real human beings, specifically the lives of black people. They were challenging what is commonly understood as the truth about black people in a white racist society to offer a counter-aesthetic. The question asked by the booming voice in Allison's play was Socratic. It was posed to demonstrate that the popular answers to the question, "What is a Negro?" do not tell the truth. In this lecture, I want to address that question as highlighting distortions within our theological anthropology, distortions that create problems for Christian ethics. By theological anthropology, I'm referring to a Christian interpretation of what it means to be human, or our fundamental understanding of human beings as made in God's image. White supremacy is a distorted theological anthropology, and historically it has served as theological justification for organizing humanity hierarchically by the contrived category of race, and deforming what we know, much of what we know as Christian moral life in the West. What we believe we know about human beings in the Western world is foundational for guiding our understanding of and interaction with everything related to heaven and earth, shaping our social interaction, our theology, our worship, and our hopes for the kingdom of God. Our interpretation of Jesus, who is the center and shape of Christian faith, sets theological anthropology in motion. The manner in which we interpret Jesus determines the contours of our moral lives. Our moral lives together, I should say. Hence, theological anthropology is intricately connected to our understanding of Jesus and determines the shape of our life together. In the early 20th century, intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance created literature and artwork depicting Jesus as black. Their depictions were representations of black cultural values and religious symbolism deployed strategically by intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois against a hegemonic aesthetic that gives license to the violence of white supremacy. Let me say, this is a painting by William H. Johnson called Jesus and the Three Marys, as this one. Something that's interesting to take note of is during the European Renaissance, there was a recovery of what was understood to be the perfect proportions of the human body. So what was depicted was beauty, and it was regulated by an understanding of modesty, proportion, the laws to understand what is beautiful. Those bodies that were represented by the European Renaissance were nothing like black bodies. And here, William H. Johnson is depicting this one. You can't really see this figure on the cross, this figure here. Or you can see some of these figures here. The fingers, the hands, the arms, the body is very non-traditional, depicting black cultural values and bodies that are shaped differently than the European norm. In later years, the theologian and pastor Howard Thurman, which my title didn't mention Howard Thurman up here, my apologies, but he is a core piece of this lecture, spoke of Jesus as a person of color whose life in Roman-occupied Palestine speaks to those who, like him, have throughout history had their backs pressed against the wall by oppressive political regimes. One more slide here, I see. Boy, I had a lot of art slides there and I didn't pay attention to that. This one, if I may say one quick thing before I go further. I have this one at the end, and we'll return to it there for a moment. But pay attention here when you look at this. Where is Jesus? And okay. This is a tradition, a black church tradition that I will refer to. I'm going to come back to at the end of this lecture with this picture. Now back to William H. Johnson. Both Howard Thurman and W.E.B. Du Bois spoke to the experience of black life in the Western world to promote and embrace black love of self and of neighbor, while simultaneously recalibrating humanity from false and disfiguring norms. By betraying the lie of a misleading theological anthropology that claims full humanity and the image of God for whites only. They illustrate for us that we cannot be faithful Christians without giving our attention to the problem inside of the question in Allison's play, What is a Negro? The move to reinterpret black life in America in alignment with reality began with the telling of slave narratives. The stories of Olaudah Equiano, Frederick Douglass, Henry Box Brown, and Harriet Jacobs, to name a few, represent the slave narrative genre. It typically included an endorsement by a white voice to lend authenticity to the story told by the main black author, or in some cases, a white author wrote the whole narrative. Sarah Bradford, a white admirer, initially told Harriet Tubman's biography titled Harriet's The Moses of Her People. She wrote it in this manner, as a slave narrative, of course. The meaning latent within these stories was that slave life was human life in bondage, rather than subhumanity in a natural servile state to white people. As Tubman's story indicates, she departed from the place of her enslavement when she was near the age of 30, bravely navigating dangerous, unknown terrain and violent slave patrols that had legal authority to kill her on sight. As she made her way towards freedom in the North, when she crossed the border of the slaveholding South and knew she'd finally reached the place of freedom, she's quoted by Bradford to have said, "I had crossed the line, I was free, but there was no one to welcome me in the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land." The land of freedom was foreign territory for a woman who'd lived her entire life in the unnatural state of bondage. But not only did Tubman become acquainted with that new geography, she also became familiar with the dangerous route to get there along the Underground Railroad. As she reasoned, she could not settle comfortably in the land of freedom while her people suffered in bondage under the cruel yoke of North America's Pharaoh and the slave system in the southern United States. She made more than a dozen long, treacherous treks back into the land of captivity to travel the Underground Railroad with other captives towards freedom. Her actions had biblical and spiritual symbolism that could be recognized by the spiritual swing low, sweet chariot coming forward to carry me home. Tubman was a driver of a sweet chariot swinging low from the north to the south, as the song depicts, to carry black people to the promised land of freedom, the freedom that was due all human beings, especially those of faith who lived in hope of its reality. As a charioteer and conductor on the Underground Railroad, she plundered a southern economy that relied on the stolen humanity and stolen labor of her passengers. The narrative of Tubman's life was clear. Her actions were not legal in a society regulated by state injustice. White supremacy and black subjectivity was the law. But as she saw it, freedom is something for which we are all made, and we are all humans. To say otherwise is to slander the very image of God that is given to all human beings. In the early 20th century, the songs and the narratives of enslaved black people remained influential components of the newly emerging black culture in Harlem, but the purpose was different. Charles Johnson argued, and he was a central figure of the Renaissance movement, argued that this generation of black people were 2 generations removed from slavery. They spoke in their own voice and they, quote, seemed to care less about what white people thought or were likely to think than about themselves and what they had to say, unquote. The work on display in the Harlem Renaissance was distinctively black culture. It was multidimensional, derived from the mixture of African roots and cultural fruits of people of African descent spread throughout the black diaspora by slavery and growing beautiful black cultures in the blend of fertilizer and soil that makes up the Western racialized understanding of human beings. But in the northern United States, this culture also helped to facilitate a new depiction of black life. The Harlem Renaissance movement made creative use of the multidimensional experiences of black people spread within the African diaspora by slavery to tell a story of human life unregulated by white supremacy. Here is a different depiction of black life. This gentleman is upwardly mobile and can defend himself. Not the pictures that were depicted of black people in the South that were really reflections of blackness from in the mind of a figure that simply wants to stabilize himself as the ascendant one, the only one with the image of God. This one is a favorite of mine. You can see it through the lights. It's called The Janitor Who Paints. Now you've got a couple of things going on with this depiction of black life. He's got a beret on, and there's a palette here, and his painting, and he's painting a picture of his wife and child who's looking at him with those eyes, that intent gaze on Dad. Family life. He's talented. He's got these abilities. But here are the tools of his trade. His day job. Which of these tell the truth about this man? Which can he put his faith in about who he really is? There's a story there that's a really interesting one to interact with. As a movement, the Harlem Renaissance was discursive. The name invoked a mode of discourse and a means of reasoning about people of African descent that was not bound to any one place. It took the name of a location, Harlem, New York, and organized participants from various sites within the United States, including Chicago and Washington, D.C., in a global dialogue about black humanity unregulated by racism. It included at least 3 levels of interaction with black humanity that can be described as the politics of racial uplift, public sexuality, and a religious interrogation of white supremacy. The politics of racial uplift is the deployment of cultural aesthetics to secure what David Levering Lewis described as civil rights by copyright. It was a self-help model that was in part was civil rights by copyright. It was a self-help model from a black middle class attempting to represent the entire race before a watching white world, to demonstrate black creative potential and to distinguish themselves as co-agents of American civilization. Some critics of racial uplift argue that the only problem its proponents had with capitalism was that it excluded black people. That was a significant problem. Imitating the white capitalist was simply a black endorsement of exploitation and greed. Critics of uplift argue that it included capitalist impulses alongside the production of culture and the appropriation of a heavily masculine 2-parent breadwinner and homemaker family model of Victorian morality, best understood by the language of the hegemonic masculine and the privileged feminine. The breadwinner and homemaker in Black Harlem was a black adaptation of hegemonic white masculinity and privileged white femininity, hegemonic and privileged because they were gender roles intended for white complementarian homes only. They were also roles that regulated sexuality, and in the politics of racial uplift, sexual regulation was a response to the sexual violence that was familiar to blacks in the southern states prior to migrating north, when rape, castration, and lynching were common occurrences that didn't make the news, but were routine interracial experiences. Racial uplift in the Harlem Renaissance was accompanied by the rhetoric of the talented 10% of the race, which would demonstrate the great potential of black humanity before a watching white world. This perspective was predicated on the notion of human equality that made peace with domination. In later years, the civil rights icon Fannie Lou Hamer registered a criticism of this understanding of equality when she said, equal to whom? Rapists? Lynchers? Murderers? That's nothing to aspire towards. We don't want equality with that, we want freedom. Another dimension of the Harlem Renaissance recognized the problems with standard uplift rhetoric that included the decentering of the heavily masculine Victorian model of morality by what Shane Bogle has described as public sexuality. This is the other, as he describes it, the other Renaissance taking place at night within the exotic spaces of the nightclubs and the blurring of the lines between the performer and the audience in provocative cabaret performances. This is the Harlem Renaissance that Greenwich Village would come uptown for, into places like the Cotton Club, which was whites only. And they would lust after and enjoy, in this licentious way, the exotic black bodies. It was what Shane Bogle calls a cabaret school of the Renaissance, where patrons of the movement indulged in a process of crossing the prescribed boundary lines of moral propriety, defined by hegemonic masculinity and privileged femininity, within the respectability politics of racial uplift. In the cabaret school, sexuality and gender were not obliged to stay within the boundaries of the script of the masculine and the feminine. Nor was the appropriation of the Victorian model considered a prescription for humanity decimated by racism. Rather, as unsettling as it was for some, including the talented 10th, who were really bothered by this, the Harlem Renaissance cabaret school of non-normativity also sought to expand the boundaries of possibility within black life by problematizing and deconstructing the masculine and feminine that was deployed as agents against the recognition of black humanity. Within this dimension of the Harlem Renaissance, black was always already political, a political form of protest against white normativity. But there was still yet a third dimension of the movement in Harlem that was a religious interrogation of the hegemonic claims of humanity by racism. That's what I'm describing as a religious critique of whiteness within the Harlem Renaissance. The provocation for this move was detailed in the decades after the Harlem Renaissance. In 1954, the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal published An American Dilemma, arguing that the lofty ideals like liberty and justice for all, boasted by the country's founders, were partly responsible for what we have in the United States as race logic. The lofty ideals were embraced by the slave-owning founding fathers who had no intention of freeing their slaves and relinquishing that very lucrative financial source. That seemingly hypocritical position caused slave-owning colonists to calibrate their anthropology towards a hegemonic ideal in order to define freedom in such a manner as to retain ownership of human beings and their lofty ideals simultaneously. Race was born in the process of a hegemonic ideology of human difference in the effort to secure the lofty ideals of liberty and justice for all humans, and to subsequently retain ownership of black flesh as subhumanity in the newly emerging land of freedom, the slave-owning United States. So in other words, by a people who claimed, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are the freedom of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These folks who owned slaves, as Gunnar Myrdal looked at this, how could this be? How could they lay claim to those creeds while vehemently demanding ownership of Africans? As he described it, it was that dichotomy that births the language of the subhumanity, of the subhuman, which is race. So that it becomes, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all humans are created equal. Those whom we have in chains are not human. They're mostly human, or partially human. Religion was an integral part of this adaptation in anthropology. The European practice of supersessionism moved the original location of God's salvific work in the world from the Middle East to Western Europe, replacing Jewish people with white Europeans as God's chosen, who are the only ones gifted with the image of God and responsible for the benevolent mastery of and salvation of the world. Brian makes a good point about this in his book, The Death of Race, by talking about creation. This master, the sovereign figure speaking over creation. The word of God becomes something that is spoken over again in another act of what he calls decreation. Where was I at? Replacing Jewish people with white Europeans as God's chosen, who are the only ones gifted with the image of God and responsible for the benevolent mastery of and salvation of the world. In the process, Jesus received a makeover, and a white European Jesus became the theological justification for white authority over all things related to heaven and earth. The white Jesus, risen with all power in his hands, became the theological validation of white ascendant masculinity as the physical representation of God's authority on earth as it is in heaven. Aesthetics and popular concepts of beauty and proportion were tools to communicate to the wider world what is beauty, intelligence, morality, and holiness. The 17th century depiction of the resurrection is that very kind of aesthetic. It's not simply a beautiful piece of art. This is political propaganda. I was talking with seminary students today over lunch, seminary students, and we were describing how, talking about, I made mention of a lecture that Du Bois did in Chicago in 1926. The lecture was titled Criteria for Negro Art. And in it, he makes a point that all art is political. It's always propaganda, always political. He says, imagine 100 years from now, speaking to the NAACP, imagine 100 years from now, if all that remained, the only pictures that remained of black people were the ones that were painted by whites, what would the future think of black people? Meaning if humankind were all gone, humans were all gone, what would the world think of black people? That beauty is in the employ, always in the employ of truth and justice. That images like this that create, that are not neutral, but to some degree propaganda and commercial for an aesthetic, or at least for one ascendant figure. Here, risen with all power, you can see him on the streets of France or Britain and so forth, and those bodies represent deity, God. If I were to have it in this slide as well, or in these slides, I would put it right next to Leonardo da Vinci's 16th century depiction of perfect proportions of a human being, Vitruvian Man. You've seen that with exactly arms like this. and he's a male. He's a naked man. The perfect proportions of the human being depicted in this way as people are also encountering other bodies in other lands in the age of discovery. The Vitruvian man, also depicted here as risen with all power in his hands. And the angels who kneel at his feet, demure, pure, holy, feminine. This is somewhat of a sales pitch for what we might say today is family values. Always admiring or elevating the white masculine as the sovereign and ascendant one. It's not just artwork. It's not objective and unbiased, in other words. Du Bois interrogated this ideology as insidious and evil. Shortly after the end of World War I in 1920, he published Dark Water as a sequel to his groundbreaking work, The Souls of Black Folk. Dark Water was a collection of essays, largely autobiographical and religious in nature, which began with a statement of belief and moved quickly to a scathing analysis of the cause of the Great War in an essay titled The Souls of White Folk. Yet the most telling essay, Jesus Christ in Texas, was symbolically situated right in the middle of the book. It was written as a contemporary parable and conveys the most poignant critique of the book. Its contents and its placement in the book offer a sober analysis of the lethal intersection of whiteness and Christianity. Jesus Christ in Texas is in one sense a long Socratic question that can be described in this manner. How would the Palestinian Jewish Messiah be received in the United States by white Christians today? You take a look at things like this here, this kind of artwork. What's happening is not just an observance of something, but there are a number of theorists and art critics. I took a class, one of my favorite classes in master's program was Theology and Art. They describe how art is interacting with the space between the viewer and the canvas, organizing, touching on what we may describe as values. You could be offended by something like this because it's touching on your values. It's the space between the viewer and the canvas that's being stirred. Like the parable of the sheep and the goats in the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, white people who describe themselves as Christians encounter the brown-skinned Jewish Jesus in multiple ways as a stranger, not recognizable in Du Bois's parable. What's worse, they're hostile towards him. In Du Bois' narratives, white people always mistake Middle Easterners for black people, and the Jewish Jesus of Du Bois' narrative is simply another black person to shun in an anti-black Christian country. The story begins with an encounter between prison officials and the stranger. Jesus at a prison. The financial interests of big business are foundational for the arrangement between prisoner and prison system, and the black inmates are the main revenue source of a very lucrative industry. The capitalist appropriation of their labor is justified by white imagination of their character, which includes a contrived assessment of their morality. A prison guard describes a black prisoner standing near by use of the N-word as a born thief. The black prisoner's subjugation to white benevolent sovereignty in this capitalist arrangement is justified by his immorality, which is biologically determined by race. That description of biologically determined morality also pertains to the inherent goodness of the white benevolent sovereign who runs the prison in a white-centered world. In a white-centered world, morality and racial identity are commingled and measured by aesthetic proximity to the idealized and deified white body. In the dark outside of the prison, the stranger disrupts the dehumanizing conspiracies of the racist capitalist prison officials with their financially incentivized anthropology by simply asking a question of their intent with the incarcerated, meant to query their ability to see the incarcerated as full human beings. But as the narrative progresses, it's in the home of the prison's lead official where we encounter the most revealing interactions between Jesus and white Christian racists. The home of the lead prison official, the colonel, is representative of a southern plantation. It's latent. You're not going to pick it up when you read it unless you're reading it carefully. And it's there that we are given the physical description of the stranger as we imagine Jesus in the United States today. In a pivotal scene, they're talking with him in low tones in the dark. They decide it's time to get some tea. The wife turns up the light and she can see, oh my gosh, he's mulatto, as they would describe it. Mixed race, he's certainly, which would mean simply Negro. And he's in our house. What will the dinner guests think? And it's an amazing scene, as I'll continue here. They've called for tea, and this butler comes in, who's what Du Bois describes as an ancient black man. He's an older black man. He immediately recognizes the stranger, drops to his knees, saying, "My Lord and my God." That's right out of the Gospel of John. The tea set hits the ground. The ancient black man says, "My Lord and my God," doubting Thomas. And the colonel's wife says, "Mother's China." Two very different value systems. So, his physical appearance is a stumbling block for the white people who encounter him in the home of the lead official. Jesus became a crisis. The colonel and his wife were expecting other important white people as dinner guests, and this colored stranger in their home was an embarrassment. He was someone with whom they must not be seen. While the husband and wife were ashamed and embarrassed by the stranger, black subjects of oppression in their home and their young child recognized him. But like the colonel and his wife, none of their dinner guests do. With the exception of a priest, an Episcopalian priest, who says, "You look familiar, I've seen you somewhere." No, I've seen you somewhere. And Jesus in this parable walks by saying, "I never knew you." The point is clear. White Christians who are comfortable with their lives in a society regulated by white supremacy would not recognize Jesus even if he were standing right in front of them. The story ends with another ironic moment. A racist white Christian woman is suddenly aghast upon learning that the stranger she'd been talking to on her porch in low lighting was not a white man. When he asked her whether she loved her neighbors, a black family who lived next door, she's clued in and raises her lamp to see in the light that he is in fact a problem. In a moment of anger and horror, she flees the presence of the brown-skinned Jesus with his life-altering talk of co-humanity and neighborliness. And she collides with a black prisoner running towards Jesus, who is his refuge in that violent racist place. That contact between the black man and the white woman is cause for lynching on the age-old sexualized accusations of sexual assault by a black man against a white woman. But as the black man writhes, dying in the noose in the tree on her property, the farmer's wife notices another figure present at the lynching. This was a painting by Charles Cullen, the poet, County Cullen's brother, of this moment in Du Bois's narrative. It was the stranger present with the lynched black man above and behind him, hanging on a cross, superimposing himself on the image of the swaying, agonizing black figure. She finally recognized him. As Du Bois says, she knew. Her dry lips moved. Despised and rejected of men. She knew. And the very horror of it lifted her dull and shrinking eyelids. There, heaven tall, earth wide, hung the stranger on the crimson cross, ribboned and bloodstained, with thorn-crowned head and pierced hands. She stretched her arms and shrieked. Interestingly, this is a Jewish Jesus in Waco. But as Du Bois argued in his narrative, white people had a difficult time distinguishing Middle Eastern people, Palestinian Middle Eastern people from Negroes, as he described it. The stranger on the cross was focused in his concerned gaze on the dying body of the thief in the noose, and did not acknowledge the white woman who was the cause of his death. The narrative ends with Jesus' words, "This day thou shalt be with me in paradise." The lynch mob's noose became an occasion for grace, replacing its more commonly known symbol of racist terrorism, by representing a point of contact between God and the suffering of black people in a racist world. Jesus is not on the side of the practitioners of domination and abuse. Jesus is repeatedly rejected and killed by them in his personal identification with victims of injustice. Thus, to die at the hands of white racist Christians is synonymous with martyrdom. 8 years later, Du Bois published a novel titled Dark Princess. In this fictional work, he imagined an alternative sort of leadership to the color line which belts the planet, violently subjecting the world to whites-only governance. Dark Princess gestures towards Du Bois' experience of the Versailles Peace Conference that he attended in 1919 with the delegation of the newly formed NAACP, when the League of Nations met and decided that Germany should shoulder total blame for World War I. There in Versailles, Du Bois and his entourage hoped to gain an audience with President Woodrow Wilson to discuss the treatment of African American soldiers and of African colonies, as the Western nations made an effort to mend the international community in the wake of World War I. But in their efforts for world peace and democracy, President Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations held fast to the color line and invited only white nation states to the conference. At Versailles, the white powers of the world maintained the violent practices of hegemony and supremacy toward the global people of color. That's when you get the distinction between the first and the third world. Intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance, like Du Bois, interpreted the peace conference as further indication that they must confront the socially distorting racecraft that is whiteness on a global scale, as represented by the international color line. In 1920, Darkwater gave an analysis of the religious motivations inside the color line. And in 1928, Dark Princess imagined global solidarity in a collective dark-skinned engagement with the struggle for leadership and political agency that would break the color line and usher in a new type of global power arrangement. In the reimagining of people of color, if the reimagining of people of color included interrogation of the distorted anthropology caused by the harmful intersection of Christianity and politics, with Darkwater and Dark Princess, Du Bois demonstrated a healthier interaction between the two, a healthier interaction between Christianity and politics. The most important character in Dark Princess is revealed at the end of the novel as another messianic figure who is the offspring of the two protagonists in the story. This messianic figure is a theopolitical symbol of global leadership. The parents of this figure are Black and East Asian, and their love for one another is fueled by their desire to work toward a world free from the trappings of the color line and its corresponding problems of distorted humanity. Matthew, the father of the messianic figure, sees the problem of the color line as one of capitalist exploitation, religion, and race. The solution to the color line involves including capable people from around the world in the practice of governance and the pursuit of peace. That would be people who are capable of leadership, with proven history or some proven talent and ability, not just money. The color line narrows the pool of potential leadership too much. And along with its inherent problems of racism, classism, and sexism, it increases the problem of poor leadership by limiting the talent pool to choose from. Breaking through the barriers of the modern, unjust, and oppressive global color line and defying its center-periphery construct would require a divine intervention, or rather, as the messianic figure's mother describes it, divine anarchy. Quote, "Birth is the method of blind fools. Wealth is the gambler's method. Only talent served from the great reservoirs of all men, of all races, of all classes, all ages, both sexes. This is real aristocracy, real democracy. the only path to that great and final freedom which you so well call divine anarchy. End of quote. The messianic figure in Dark Princess is a prince of peace. He is the future possibility for black leadership in an international community, born in Virginia, the birthplace of race-based slavery in the United States. Du Bois' messianic figure in Dark Princess emerges as the offspring of the oppressed, dark-skinned world to penetrate the barriers that hinder real peace, justice, and democracy in the world. These two works by Du Bois interact with the question, what is a Negro, at the intersection of race, religion, and politics as the site of distortion that harms the world. According to Du Bois, white failure to acknowledge humanity in black flesh is a much more serious problem than they recognize. It also harms white people. White hegemony and supremacy is deadly for the whole world, not just black people, precisely because it distorts all humanity. It is financially incentivized anthropology that is rallied to stabilize the white masculine sovereign as the only full human figure, and is a legitimizing ideology for destructive practices that harm the entire world. We all must get beyond this evil if the world is to survive. Jesus and the disinherited. Howard Thurman included a theological analysis of this same sovereign figure as he targeted the moral implications of racist theological anthropology in his classic text, Jesus and the Disinherited. He describes a discursive encounter with this harmful figure during a visit to present-day Sri Lanka in 1935 as the catalyst for the book. Thurman chaired a delegation of American students on a pilgrimage of friendship that unintentionally included a conversation with a Hindu school official in Sri Lanka. That conversation haunted him to the point that he had to write what is now a classic text. The school official said this to him: the name of one of the British slave ships was Jesus. I am Hindu. I do not understand. Here you are in my country, standing deep within the Christian faith and tradition. I do not wish to seem rude to you, but sir, I think you are a traitor to all the darker peoples of the earth. I'm wondering what you, an intelligent man, can say in defense of your position. He meant as a black Christian. For more than 5 hours, Thurman and the school officials sat and discussed that question and the deep irony of an African-American Christian from the Christian, pro-white, anti-black United States. For Thurman, a clue to his Christian position that sets black Christianity over and against racist counterfeits begins with acknowledging Jesus' historical context. Taking Jesus out of context turns him into an avatar for people and movements motivated by things other than the gospel. Thurman emphasized the fact that Jesus was a Jew, not a European white man. This is not incidental because it points to the culture and traditions that informed his worldview. Unless anyone might make light of that factor as not so significant in a world where people of an ethnicity can have access and comfort, Thurman points out that Jesus was a poor Jew. His economic situation places him in solidarity with most of the world's population, the majority of whom are poor people of color. Additionally, Jesus was, quote, a member of a minority group in the midst of a larger, dominant, and controlling group, unquote, which is to say, Jesus was a member of a stigmatized and oppressed community. As a poor Jewish member of a colonized land, Jesus knew oppression from experience. He did not know the favorable side of the color line. He was one of the disinherited. A marginalized member of society who, like many others after him knew the experience of having their backs pressed against the wall by a politically oppressive regime. The implications of this realization are significant. Jesus, as a member of the ascendant and powerful, becomes an ideological weapon in the hands of the socially and politically influential, justifying hegemony and abuse. Obedience to that Jesus is surrender to violence rendered in multiple creative ways by the powerful, mutilating and disfiguring human beings. But acknowledging Jesus as one of the disinherited does something completely different. To be sure, there is a caution. To be sure, there is a caution that we must heed when we address the white Jesus in this way. We must be careful not to pull Jesus to the margins in a racialized society, which is to make Jesus black inside of the construct imagined by whiteness. There is a way of recognizing blackness that remains within the confines of white supremacy. That Jesus may offend, but his offense merely validates the racialized structures by making him contrived blackness. Blackness that is the counterweight to whiteness in a world that is structured by white supremacy. Finally, making him an offense to everyone. He is the relief within opiate religion that mollifies the victim of anti-black suffering but does not ask for social change or an end to suffering. He encourages disciples to take suffering as their lot on earth, leaving their expectation for a better life in heaven. With this Jesus, black Christians are dying to live. He becomes the willing scapegoat for the sins of the world, and sins are laid upon his back violently, with theological justification and righteous indignation by a world that fetishizes and hates black flesh. That black Jesus is from the world of whiteness. That blackness as the visible anchor to the ever-invisible yet standard-making white. That is blackness as the visible anchor to the ever-invisible yet standard-making white. White is normal humanity, and blackness is abnormality and hostility to all that is good and decent. It is the jungle in the minds of whiteness, projected onto the bodies of real people as a movie is projected onto a blank canvas, where beasts and monsters are labeled according to everyday anthropologies that organize humanity in ways that we are familiar with. Race is that working category of everyday anthropology that works as a set of lenses behind our eyes, projecting our precognitive understanding of humanity onto bodies, animating them and hearing them speak before they actually say a word. Darren Wilson said of Michael Brown, "It looked like a demon." Real life is obscured in this process. Black Jesus must be more than this. Otherwise, our understanding of Jesus remains captured by the logic of white supremacy, merely pulling Jesus to the margins of a world imagined for the white sovereign. We can come back to that in the Q&A. The black Jesus identified by Du Bois and recognized by Thurman is different. He is unregulated by whiteness. He comes to us from the outside of the regulating process of whiteness and is always a threat to the status quo that would try to confine him by white supremacy's script of hegemonic humanity. But he cannot be captured. Blackness in this regard is complete otherness to the regulated world of race and whiteness. It is unregulated humanity. The humanity of the slave latent within the psyche of the self that is untouched by the history of violence meant to turn an African into a Negro. This is the secure human within, an improvisational humanity that is there in spite of the efforts of whiteness to obliterate it. Should the white Christian recognize humanity in the dehumanized, they would come face to face with their own actual humanity. Yet the black Christ remains wholly other as a stumbling block in the hope of the world, as he was in Du Bois' narratives. This black hope for the world is the departure point for a healthy Christian moral response to whiteness. Those who practice hegemony and domination fear losing control over others, not only because they love power, but because they fear experiencing the abuse they give should switch places. Fear of experiencing the abuse that they would receive should they switch places. But Thurman describes that the Jesus of color from Palestine, who was wholly other than white hegemonic masculine, than the white hegemonic masculine, and his response to oppression, is not dictated by the demands put in place by oppression. Interestingly, this is an argument similar to what Miroslav Volf makes in his book, Exclusion and Embrace. Oppressors unleash hounds that dog the disinherited, which Thurman names as fear, deception, and hatred, but they do not control the response of this dark-skinned Jesus. Historically, the oppressed have responded to those hounds in one of two ways: to assimilate or accommodate the violence by simply going along with it and becoming participants in state-sanctioned injustice against their own people. This was a path of the priestly class and the Sadducees, who acquiesced to the Roman authority and received status and financial compensation for cooperation with injustice. The other option was to embrace the use of violence to secure liberation. This was the path of the Sicarii and the Zealot. These proponents of violence sought to rid their land of oppressors by bloodshed. Jesus chose another response to the violent political and religious dangers of his day. In response to fear, Jesus advocated diffusing the lies of inhumanity that fear trains in the psyche of the oppressed and the oppressor. Fear is like a creature that can kill one's self-image, and it resides on both sides of the color line. The threat of an actual lived experience of violence trains fear into the psyche of the victim and perpetrator alike, which conditions everyone to avoid exposure to one another. The threat of violence is a type of pedagogy that trains the disinherited in their social value while giving the privileged a false and exaggerated sense of their self. Rather than give in to fear, the black Jesus advocates that the disinherited remember their place in the family of God. Deception is one of the oldest mechanisms used by the disinherited against the strong for survival. The oppressed have survived by fooling the strong. Both sides recognize the continued practice of deception, and both are dependent upon it as a weapon to secure what they desire. The advantaged make use of it to rob the oppressed of their basic social, civil, and political rights, seemingly without them knowing that robbery is occurring. And the weak make use of deception in an effort to secure something of their rights against the strong, or simply to survive. In the process, incessant lying degrades the humanity of both groups. Not to be killed turns survival into a point of departure for all moral reasoning, and deception into a moral virtue. Rather than practice deception, Jesus practiced complete sincerity, Thurman says, and integrity of person. Hypocrisy on the part of the disinherited in dealing with the dominant group, Thurman claimed, is a tribute yielded by those who are weak. But when the disinherited following Jesus are completely sincere, there is no moral ground given to the socially advantaged. There is simply interaction between two human beings. Lastly, Thurman describes hatred in the minds and spirits of the disinherited as the product of great bitterness. Hatred is like the fire that cannot be contained. It burns in the heart and mind of the disinherited toward the agents of their abuse. But it also damages the souls of the oppressed who nurture it. Hatred in the hearts and minds of the advantaged of society is born of stereotypes, not of interaction with real people. It must be said that Thurman's description of hatred is best understood as dual instances of prejudice, not racism. Racism is the manufacture and maintenance of systems and structures for whites only, and was born in the creation of the ascendant white sovereign masculine as the ideal human. Hatred accompanies the racialized practice of maintaining white spaces, but it does not depend on affect. It is an ideology of oppression that reproduces itself within society as a mode of discipleship. instructing followers toward goods to desire. Hatred is a secondary effect of racism, practiced by people on both sides of the color line as response to this hound that dogs the disinherited. As a response, Jesus advocated love. That unnatural response is also not dependent on affect, but is an attack on the enemy status of the other, undoing the problematic and hegemonic status that confines humanity within the community, distorting anthropology. Love is the only means that we have of correcting the disfiguring work of the financially incentivized anthropology that justifies a hierarchy of humanity and distorts Christian morality. Love of self, equal knowledge of self, is the enabling practice of loving others. To say that again, love of self equals knowledge of self, I should say, and is enabling of love of others. In this regard, the Black Christ that Du Bois and Thurman advocate is indeed the Savior of the world. I have one more point to make. One last point in a very long lecture. Thank you for hanging in. I want to talk a little bit more, just one more point about this Black Christ. This is, by the way, one of the longest lectures I've given. Yeah. I know you're laughing, but some of you are like, please, hurry up. I want to end by returning to the Harlem Renaissance for a moment, to make one final point. In addition to the ethical norms that we've heard from Thurman and Du Bois, Black Christians in the West have had no choice but to address the lethal history of appropriation of Christ by whites. From the transatlantic slave trade that usurped Christianity as an apologetic for kidnapping Africans to assimilate them in Western empires, to the 19th century scramble for Africa, authorized by the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, and resulting in the civilized colonial annexation by the various Western European empires of the continent of Africa. We didn't have the boundary lines that we do of nation states in Africa before the scramble for Africa, authorized by the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. Thurman's Hindu interlocutor indicated a Christological hermeneutic has been an operative source of moral guidance within forms of Western Christianity, directing oppressive encounters with others for centuries, as Du Bois said. The characteristic of our age is the contact of European civilization with the world's underdeveloped peoples. War, murder, slavery, extermination, and debauchery. This has been, again and again, the result of carrying civilization to the blessed gospel to the isles of the sea and the heathen without the law. That was from Du Bois. The problem, as I see it, is not merely one of disfiguring anthropology claims, disfiguring anthropology, those claims within Christology. It is the way that combination became justification for white supremacy. Christ in Europe became the idealized depiction of us. This is the point I'm trying to make. As white Europeans saw themselves replacing Jews in God's salvation history. I should say this is one latent within this lecture. Christ became white and whiteness became hegemonic humanity. Christ, as representative of hegemonic, violent, ascendant white humanity, was in truth a fetishized theological figure to stabilize a white, self-possessed, sovereign, masculine figure. This abstract figure continues to serve as the template by which to measure all of humanity. That's an important thing. So you keep moving. Whiteness has so blended Christianity and hegemonic Western anthropology that to problematize one is to interact with the other. Scholars of the Harlem Renaissance made a frontal attack on the white Christian appropriation of Christ with its subsequent idealized white humanity. The social encounter between black people and white racist Christians in the overtly racist United States betrayed the lie that white Christianity has something of value to offer society behind the dreams it gives to whites of idealized humanity for idealized community. this longing for Mayberry. As Harlem Renaissance intellectuals argue, white racist Christianity results in a religion that prioritizes confession and creed over social interaction. Rather, their analysis sought to highlight social interaction as the point of departure for recognizing right and wrong. And although the Harlem Renaissance was not a confessional Christian movement, its adherents made use of their familiarity with black Christian communities in their multi-layered interrogation of the interconnection between whiteness and divinity. What was most important for their analysis and for our understanding of the ethical implications of Black Christ is what Charles Long described as theologies of the opaque. Opaque is contrasted with transparent, which is what people and cultures on the lower rungs of the white racial hierarchy are made to become. Long refers to Paul Tillich's interpretation of the crucifixion as a graphic illustration of transparency. Jeff and I were talking about this over lunch. According to Tillich, on the cross, Jesus became transparent so that believers could see God. The suffering body, then, is rendered invisible. What is seen is an abstract God. Theologians of opacity will not allow this suffering body to be ignored, which is the historical treatment it receives within the hegemonic anthropologies associated with the Western Empire. It looks something like this. What is demanded in this case is to make apparent the lives of people relegated to invisibility and non-being as their suffering goes morally unaccounted for. Biological markers like skin color within a sick theological anthropology signify different levels of social worth and moral responsibility. Theologies of the opaque, like those highlighted by imagining Jesus as black, help facilitate the necessary deconstruction of harmful ideologies by making suffering apparent. A healthier theological ethics begins with making social interaction the point of departure for interpreting the way of Jesus, who comes to us representing a blackness that is wholly other than the world regulated by whiteness. As such, this Jesus represents an incarnation that demonstrates a new humanity as the salvation of the world. Now I kept you really long. Let's stop there for some dialogue.
First of all, thank you.
You want to go back to that?
So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Williams to kind of take hands and things like that. So go ahead and raise your hands. We have some time for some questions, for clarification, follow-up. Yep.
I'm sure there's lots of stuff to clarify.
Thank you.
You were going to comment on that.
The other one, yeah, I want to go back to that one there. It's right there.
That one, yeah.
That one there, yeah. Is that what you were going to?
Yeah, that was it.
So, back to the notion of theology of the opaque. When one looks at this painting here, by the way, this is by one of the most popular artists of the Harlem Renaissance, one of the most known. His name is Aaron Douglas. This was painted for James Weldon Johnson's collection of black sermons called God's Trombones. This one was painted for the Crucifixion, a sermon called the Crucifixion. In this, you have the normal, the work of black art created by Aaron Douglas was an amalgamation of things. It's two-dimensional Egyptian tomb paintings, you know, yeah. Here, that's what's represented, angular, two-dimensional stuff. And the faces are West African Dan masks. Here. There. African. Uniquely African. But then there's another thing, what this is depicting here is a tradition that I grew up knowing. Who is this person here?
Simon of Cyrene.
You get it. This is, I believe, the fifth station of the cross. When Jesus couldn't carry his cross anymore. Beaten and tired. Simon from Cyrene, North Africa, black people. Simon was forced to carry the cross. When that black body picked up that cross, black people picked up the suffering of Jesus as well. That's what's being depicted here. There is an implication that's being made here. If black people are picking up the suffering of the cross, of the suffering of Christ, what does that say of their abusers? They're also guilty of the suffering of Jesus. This is a theological claim that's being made here as well. Forcing you to see the suffering of Jesus. I had to get through the theology of the opaque before I got to talk about this. Other comments or questions?
Dr. Williams, and maybe this is naive, but I go back to that painting, the 17th century painting of the white Jesus. And I think how many individuals looking at that painting would not see anything of what you see in it, right? Would not see anything unusual or strange.
Right.
So how do we teach to see differently? I mean, your lecture is an example of that.
Right.
So what further advice would you have? Because, I mean, that's a norm, right?
Right. And norms are what? It's normative. It is depicting of norms.
Yes.
And it is also, it is advertising normativity, kind of normativity. This speaks to standards and rules and regulation for understanding human bodies and divinity, and the correlation between human bodies and divinity. It's normatizing. How do you gain access to a perspective outside of the normalizing or the normatizing that this is demonstrating? How do you gain access, well, something along the lines of how to explain water to a fish, which is what's going on here when we look at this? How do you do that?
How do you a university scholar?
Yeah, this is advertisement.
What was the date of ours?
Carl Bloch, and it's 1700s. I can't remember the exact year of that. 1700s. Very popular artist. But it's also so very common to see Jesus depicted in this way. I grew up with Warner Solomon's Head of Christ in my grandmother's living room.
Sure.
Everybody, grandmother had Warner Solomon hanging, Head of Christ hanging in the living room. Warner Solomon's Head of Christ is a very good artistic rendering of the Vitruvian letter. I'm sorry, Vitruvian letter. The what's that?
Vitruvian Man.
Not Vitruvian Man. I think the Publius Lentulus letter. Publius Lentulus. It's a person who was supposedly present in the first century and saw Jesus and described him. And wow, how fascinating. He looks a whole lot like a French dude. Or British guy or something like that. It's amazing. The similarity. And it's a pseudepigraphal letter. It's from the I forget which century, something along the lines of the 16th century or something like that. It's just describing a European guy. The movie Jesus of Nazareth, that was wildly popular, is a cinematic rendering of Warner Solomon's Head of Christ, which is centering Christology and deity on white European man. Again, how do you gain the ability to do that kind of analysis to see these norms, which are nothing more than racialized norms, as the standards for our Christian faith in the United States?
Sir, being a black man, I never thought that that was the archetype body. I mean, I just never thought that growing up in the United States. I just knew that that was our Lord and Savior. He died for me. I didn't feel guilty that I was black. I just don't agree with that.
That is our Lord and Savior. That's the point where I'm stopping. If our Lord and Savior is a white European man, and that is the standard, that is the ideal human.
I know that he's not a white European man. They're just artists from the time. But
yeah,
I'm just saying is that I know that they look like that, so they're going to paint like what they see.
yeah.
But I know that that's not what he looks like. And I don't feel guilty that I don't look like that too. You know,
And often, and that's fantastic. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with how you say you feel about when you look at that. But ultimately, there's something at stake that's much more than your affect. That's what I'm talking. That's what I'm getting.
Yes, sir.
That's what I'm
Yes,
getting.
sir. I mean, I'm only one man. But
You're one person, but even then, there's much more at stake than your affect and your feelings. One's worldview includes a whole lot more than whether or not you feel good or bad or right or wrong. That's not the point. Whether or not it makes you feel bad. No, that's not or even.
I was trying to say I don't feel subjugated. That's the point I'm trying to make.
And I can appreciate that. I remember a course that I taught in undergrads where I had a minoritized student who just really did not like the language of poverty because she felt like her family had come out of poverty, and where our complaining about poverty is just whining about people who could otherwise lift themselves up by their bootstrap. But what that does not do is highlight the way systems and structures are arranged around things like this. And that this is actually an apologetic on display for slavery. When that man, as I was describing in the lecture, that Hindu man said, "Don't you know they had a slave ship named Jesus?" The apologetic on display for slavery was the spreading of civilization and culture, which included religion. If this is Jesus, and Jesus looks like this, and this is the creation of norms and cultures, there is something we have to pay attention to. That's the point. Something really important to listen to. What does this do historically to society? That's the point. Not simply a painting. This is putting a finger on something happening within society where we live. It's not just a painting that would make us feel one way or another. What does it say about the society we live in? That's what's being discussed. The values, the norms that are being lived, that are being embraced and described as holy and good. Yeah.
I might have misunderstood you, but are you saying that if we thought of Christ as a black man, it would be better off for society?
Black, as I was saying, black inside of the construct created by white supremacy is a problem. How do we understand what blackness is? Is it simply by describing him as a black man? Black meaning black like the Fawn, Yoruba, Mindi came to understand themselves as when they entered the slave ship? Is that the blackness we're talking about? And I'm saying no, definitely not that blackness. Blackness as a non-regulated humanity, something different than the world of race and racialized structures. That's what I'm talking about. What is that black?
That's you and me. We are that.
Are we that? By whom? Because you say you're that? There is also a matter of what race does to us. As society interacts with us, you are demanded to interact with what society says black is. We know the interaction because people may say, boy, you don't sound black. Or, you are an educated person? That's different than most blacks. Or, the feeling of the need to show that I actually did not take something when I walked out of the store, but I didn't buy something. Or whatever, white, whatever black, all of the different kind of stereotypes where one can be acting white or acting black. That is the demand to society, latent within society, that's called performance, performativity. Happens as well with gender. When somebody is acting like a woman, when they're man, or a sissy man, or something like that, and someone's acting like a man as a woman. The demands, social demands of performativity. How do we interact with that as people of color in a society that's racialized? It goes beyond my individual aspirations for myself. Yeah, I may say that I am comfortable in my black skin, but you always have to interact with what performativity is demanding of you. You always have to do that. How do we do that? I can't just say, I feel okay. So you have to have some kind of tools to regulate this very racialized society. That's the kind of stuff I'm pressing by interacting with the way it has been enmeshed with theology and our worship.
So when I was sort of sorting out and becoming a follower of Christ in college, paintings like that turned me off. Not for any of the reasons you talked about, because I hadn't thought about a big cookie. Because they look fake. They look, Jesus doesn't look real. He doesn't look human. He doesn't, I mean, he's not earthy enough. And so I see a painting like that, it's like, it wasn't anything like that. I mean, I'm sure, like Easter lilies right by the door.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't evoke anything in me except let's get on to the next painting.
Yeah.
And so, now, admittedly, that's 200 years later.
Right.
So we don't, at least I wouldn't know, how was that painting received? Was it acclaimed, or did they think it was dumb back then?
Right.
So I guess I'm feeling that maybe the propaganda piece is coming on maybe a little too strong, because I think you might need a little more support for that. Because you could argue that the painter was just as much a victim of the propaganda as a propagator of the propaganda.
Oh, I would definitely say that the painter was a victim.
That painting does nothing for me except let's go to the next painting.
Sure,
And the other ones you showed are more, well, going back to the opaque, let's not miss the body. Those talk a lot, they speak a lot more, I think. I don't speak for myself, but it was the humanity of Christ that drew me in. It's the incarnation. He's really a human person.
Yeah.
And suffered and all that stuff. And so, I mean, yeah, maybe it's propaganda. I just think it's dumb.
Well, in that regard, both of you, I totally appreciate that you would think that it's dumb. I do too. Actually, it's less dumb. More in cities.
In what?
In cities.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Now,
So that comes out, you said at the end of the 1700s.
yeah.
So I'm not real good at the technology of the late 1700s, but I'm going to guess that very few people actually saw that painting. I mean, it's not like it was. It's not like it was Instagrammed or something.
Well, not like the technical media that we have
Today,
but
yeah.
the artist was a very popular one, which is why I'm
Okay.
displaying it. I'm going to show you another one.
But where I was going was to say, the force of that is that there's 1,000 others like it. I personally have never seen, to my knowledge, I've never seen that image.
Yeah.
But I've seen countless others just like it, just as with a Jesus and just as white. You know.
You're seeing everything on my computer here. I can't hide that right now. In my folder where I've got a ton of these depictions. But this is also a really interesting one. I'm only showing some depictions that are highlighting values in society. So something that's kind of tripping us up, it seems to me, is how it makes me feel. While that's important to pay attention to, it's also important to hear the resonances of this kind of thing within a Christian America, which is what I'm getting at. Rather than the location of oneself as the indication of whether that this is true. What is this saying about society? We don't have the ability to step outside of this culture and society to do the kind of analysis that we would like to, perhaps. We are embedded within it. Now, I'd like to claim a space that is untouched by the society that I belong to. I'd like to be able to claim that there is such a thing. But I am in this community. And the community does impact and affect me. What does this kind of stuff say about the community where I live and this Christian United States, where this kind of thing is clearly not a thing of the past? This is a contemporary artist, just to point that out. And it's hard to see him here very, very well. I was showing this today to the seminary students. John McNaughton here. This is not a joke. He's not joking. He's showing this is Jesus and this is the Constitution and a little child shall lead them. What Dorothy Zerla is pointing out as what she described in her book on suffering as Christofascism. You may disagree, as I do as well. The question is our ability to do analysis of what kind of Christianity this is.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Williams. I was just curious what wisdom you could point us to in terms of that third dimension from the Harlem Renaissance, the religious interrogation of whiteness, and to see the whiteness connected to things like patriarchy and heteronormativity, and how to think those things together, especially when we talk about our picture of Christ.
Yeah, very good, very good. I'm a fan. I actually learned quite a bit about Christian ethics at the very beginning of my program by reading people like Kelly Brown Douglas, Dolores Williams, Emily Towns, the Womanists. They're very, very helpful in that regard. Another one that's been helpful for my analysis more recently was Brian's mentor, as well as a mentor of mine, though not directly at the school. He's been very generous with his wisdom. Willie Jennings' book, Christian Imagination. Very, very good for a social analysis like this. In regards to more along the lines of the Harlem Renaissance moment, there are only a few people who are beginning to look at that as a theological thing. And not many of them are theologians and ethicists. I am the one that I know of as a theologian doing that kind of work. But Joseph Surratt has just published a book called Spirit in the Dark, where he's doing a historical religious analysis of this. Charles Long, who I mentioned in the essay, also is a religionist, black religionist. His book called Significations is this fascinating religious interaction with this kind of thing. Stuart Hall, though not doing religious analysis, Stuart Hall is a cultural critic who would ask the question we were talking about with regards to blackness. Stuart Hall has this really masterful essay, what is it black in black culture? Where we're doing this kind of analysis of blackness. It's taking blackness, or the analysis of blackness, outside of this world of performativity and social demands, but looking at humanity in a different way. Stuart Hall is one. Those are the ones that come up for me off the top of my head. Yes?
Just wanted to ask a question of how does the depiction of Black Jesus affect other views of Jesus, such as the views of Jesus as victim, as victor, and as teacher healer?
Other views of Jesus as victim and victor?
Victor and teacher healer.
Teacher healer? Interesting question. Interesting question. What does the image of Jesus, who is representative of the ascendant and powerful, have to do with the one who was crucified? There is another, one of the ways I would begin to answer that question is the connection of Jesus to suffering, and the moral implications that gives us to others in society who are Christ's disciples. It would seem that the Christianity on display in politically oppressive structures ignores the fact that Christ was crucified by the state. They can comfortably practice oppression as though that didn't happen. So, if that is the case, that they ignore or forget that Christ was a victim of an oppressive state, perhaps then, as Cone says, those who identify with Jesus, who are people of color, recognize that if God was with Christ on the cross and that there is a resurrection, then perhaps then God is certainly with me and us in our oppression. So victory has a different ring to it, a different tone to it than those who start with all power and victory in their discipleship. Does that make sense? Yes.
So, in the face of centuries of distorted propaganda, taking away this idea, it's sort of like a racialized understanding of theology, is the pragmatic solution to address politics, like we need to go to the system of politics in order to address this propaganda and sort of stem new cultural literacy, or does it go to the school system with what, do you have any like, practical solutions, systematic, or is this more reflective?
What immediately to do? When I'm talking about the Harlem Renaissance, one of the things that's helpful about the Harlem Renaissance is a moment in which black people say what white people say about us is not right. And there is this introspective moment here that is reclaiming or interacting with anthropology that's harmful and dangerous. Anthropology from that they're addressing works like, to use the language, dysphemism. You familiar with euphemism? Euphemism is calling something typically bad by a good name. In my church, we talk about people crossing River Jordan into death. That's euphemism. Dysphemism is something where you call something that is typically good. You may name something that is good by a derogatory name. Happens in war all the time. In Vietnam, they were not Vietnamese people, they were a G word. You know? There are all sorts of dysphemic language for non-white people in the United States as well. And my brother-in-law is a Marine, and he talks about all these dysphemic language for Arabic people, or Iraqi people. Dysphemism works like a shield lowered over one's conscience, so that person that I'm shooting or abusing is not human, they're that dysphemic figure. It's a complete distortion of anthropology. And in the Harlem Renaissance, they're reclaiming away from dysphemism, black humanity. What some people who would claim that the Harlem Renaissance failed because white people didn't start seeing black people, didn't work to change their image of black people. The reason why that didn't happen so much is because it wasn't the need to see black life as human life that was important about the Harlem, that's important in a white supremacist society. It's the effort to sustain white ascendancy that is the problem. That is the problem. So black people had a moment of reconfiguring or interacting with blackness. Where is the corresponding white movement that says that white humanity is not deified humanity? That where white folks may say, what white supremacy says about me is wrong. Where is that corresponding humanity, corresponding movement? That's where the pragmatic is, that's the pragmatic that I'm talking about. To undo the way whiteness has structured white identity. That includes moves of justice in society as well. This, the way this ascendant white figure works politically is to distribute money money for education according to zip codes that are racialized. Is in places like Chicago, where my wife works at a school, she's been working on a school on the south side of Chicago. There are kids over there, because the zip code's primarily black, those children can grow up without ever seeing fresh fruit. Food deserts. If the shootings that are happening on the south side of Chicago were happening on the north side of Chicago, we probably had the National Guard in the neighborhood. Things of that nature. Because those human lives are not actual human lives. They're not the bodies of those ascendant figures. Justice in the courts, equal education, these kinds of things are all structured politically, biopolitically.
Just a quick follow-up question. So would you say that organizations like Black Lives Matter stand for this type of movement, or is this a call for something entirely new?
No, it's the call for it's that kind of movement. Black Lives Matter is that kind of movement. They're not all of the same. It's different than the civil rights movement. You'll have different groups doing different things, and there are sometimes they'll do some silly things. There was one event where they were shouting down Angela Davis. You can't shout down Angela Davis. What are you doing? You can use legal guidance, but the intent behind it is what Coretta Scott King said. Liberation is never won. You must fight for it and win it in every generation. So that is a modern day liberation movement. Everybody knows that all lives matter. I mean, good Lord, of course you know that. But until you can say in the face of such inhumanity and white supremacy that Black Lives Matter, you don't mean all lives matter. That's just a white racist rejoinder. You don't mean it. Yes.
You warned that in thinking about Jesus as black, one needs to be careful not to, that blackness is not the way blackness is configured within a white supremacist structure.
Right.
And I wondered, and you said that, I think, that that there is a black Christian spirituality that essentially parallels white Christianity.
Yes.
In saying that the only place that this is really going to get ever worked out is when we all meet beyond the pearly gates. Essentially, a black version of the white capitulation to just say, it ain't worth even trying. It's
Right.
too hard.
Right.
And we'll just let the Lord sort it out after we're all dead.
Right. Right.
I don't know where I'm going with that, except that my own conviction is that Christianity that's all about getting to heaven is completely wrong, whether it's black or white.
Right.
And
Yes.
that might be an implication that when the heart of Christianity is the direction of Jesus' prayer in the Lord's Prayer, that thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, as opposed to waiting for heaven.
Amen. Amen. You know, you sound a little bit like Walter Rauschenbusch making those claims, and quite a bit like Glenn Stassen, I mentioned, who made the argument that what Jesus meant about kingdom get into what did Jesus understand about kingdom? When he's talking about the kingdom of heaven is at hand, or is present. What did he mean by that? What did he understand about that? And what would that have meant to the people who he was saying that to? What was in their mind when Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven is here, or is at hand? And he names the Beatitudes and is giving the Sermon on the Mount. What was in the air? He didn't have to, the scriptures don't show that he stopped and broke down and said, this is what I mean by kingdom. That he's speaking a language that was common there. What was that language? And you would know it by listening to what he says when he gets up to do his first sermon in Luke chapter 4. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to set at liberty those who are not. It's about deliverance. What Jesus is understanding is the kingdom is the language of the kingdom coming is about deliverance. Well, we use the language as well of liberation. But God is about doing something on behalf of people who are subjugated. Right now, the kingdom is not just a place you wait for, it's something we are doing. One of the problems that has happened in the blending of Christianity and cruelty is that the kingdom has become, as what I was saying, primarily doctrine and abstract. It's about right belief, much less about how we live in social interaction with each other. But I was saying this today to Brian's class, Jesus in Matthew 25 tells us a parable that Bonhoeffer picks up on. He picks up on the parable of the compassionate Samaritan. This is one of two that I'll highlight here real quickly at the end. The parable of the compassionate Samaritan. Both the priest and the Levite walk by the person bloodied and beaten in the ditch, waiting to left for dead. They walk by. And then the Samaritan helps him out. The beginning of the parable is, who is my neighbor? The lawyer asks. At the end of the parable, Jesus says, who was neighbor to him? If you're not careful, you miss the fact that he put the question, who is neighbor to him? And the implication is, you are the neighbor. You are always the neighbor. Go and be neighborly. That is living a particular kind of way in social interaction with others. The other one is Matthew 25. When the Son of Man returns, he will separate sheep from the goats. He will separate people like a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. He says to those on his right, well done, good and faithful servant. I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. Thirsty, you gave me something to drink. In prison, you visited me. I was a stranger, you took me in. I was naked, you clothed me. He's not talking about doctrine. And it's clear that he's talking to people who understand themselves as Christians, or better yet, because Christian didn't exist yet, as followers, disciples. He's clear, he's talking to people who think of themselves as disciples. Because on the left, they're saying, well, are you kidding? When did we see you? Of course we would have done that for you if we knew it was you. But when you didn't do it to the least of these, my sisters and brothers of humanity, you didn't do it to me. That's one of the things that theology of opaqueness is talking about. Not to look past the suffering body, but to see the suffering body and the demands that it makes of you in social interaction. That your Christianity is Christopraxis, not abstractions. That you must be able to see humanity in humanity when humanity is standing in front of you. But humanity as a hegemonic category causes theology to be lived in this abstract way when you have interaction with bodies who are not ideal. That are not the ideal, in which you end up missing that interaction with Christ. Kept you going for a long time.
Let's thank Dr. Williams.